The old farms and houses on Denmark's middle island Funen seem to have grown out of the rolling landscape. Built by nature's own materials, with timber frames and roofs of straw, it's as if they've always been here. If they disappear, something will be missing. It just wouldn't be Funen anymore. A Funen farm is built around a quadrangular cobblestone yard. Funen was rich in good timber, which was used in ample measure. The period developed a sophisticated half-timber technique, which was also rich in aesthetic refinement. The timber was nearly always oak, and that in solid dimensions. A unique trait of the half-timber constructions on Funen is the use of filler timber in the lower squares of the wall. On certain farms, the external wings are built by boulders combined with half-timbering, or by boulders placed in orderly patterns. An unfailing instinct for an aesthetic, comprehensive effect. But many of the old farms are threatened by decay or drastic rebuilding. The National Board of Planning under the Ministry of the Environment has investigated the state of Funen's old farms. Marn's farm is situated on central Funen. No one's certain of its age, but parts of the buildings date back to the 17th century. Maren Pedersen lives alone on the farm now, but the family does help her with maintenance. Each day, Maren's son-in-law comes over to feed a couple of the young cows in the stable. Maren's farm has that rarity of the modern farming era, a genuine old dunghill with lots of flies. In many ways, Maren's farm is typical of Funen's quadrangular farms. The farmhouse follows the traditional layout and contains numerous features which show us the usage and changes of farms through several hundred years. The upper parlour is the best room and houses the family's finest furniture. The upper parlour was only used on solemn occasions and at balls or sausage feasts where neighbours and friends were invited over for fresh meat after slaughtering. The alcoves used to be in the middle room, but in Maren's farm they were rebuilt into regular bedrooms around 1810. At the same time, a small projection was added to the side facing the garden. Such projections are seen on numerous Funen farms. In the general room, we find the big table where the many family members and servants gathered for their meals. The windows date back to 1850, more than 140 years old. Window frames are finely profiled, casting a soft and pleasant light into the room. Wooden panels are mounted along the walls where stationary benches were placed. The panels have painted wood imitations, pine painted as light oak. That was high fashion. The beautiful hand-wrought ironmongery on the door to Maren's scullery is well over 250 years old. The recessed milk cellar is preserved on Maren's farm. The milk was placed here for cooling in big vessels so that the cream could be skimmed. The farms usually made their own cheese and butter. These jobs were only taken over by the cooperative dairy at the end of the last century. The front entrance gate reveals the frame of the livestock buildings, a pillar construction used most places on Funen prior to 1820. The roof is carried by a row of single pillars placed some 7 meters apart. This gives plenty of free space in the buildings. The pillars are cut from heavy oak timber and bear the marks of the previous use of building timber. Maren's farm is rich in detail, illustrating life on this farm down through the centuries. The farm has just been listed as a protected building in order to be preserved in its entirety. The protection means that it cannot be altered or demolished without permission. On the other hand, it can receive financial support for restoration work, such as the costly thatched roof. Wilhelmsgave is well hidden behind Svanninge Hills. The exterior of this farm is not quite typical for Funen farms. The farm buildings have been adapted to the needs of changing times. The farm is well preserved and has interesting features, such as the scullery door, with its panels and carvings in many colors. But where could one get a replacement door? Wilhelmsgave has belonged to the same family since the 18th century. Two sisters live there now, Magda Rasmussen and Anna Christensen.
Jeg er født her på gården, og har tilbragt det meste af min tid her.
I was born on this farm and have spent most of my life here. I was 8 before I was sent to school because it was too far away. Instead, I was taught at home, and the teacher came out to the house to make sure I learnt something. As far back as I remember, we've always had 3 farm hands and a couple of maids. Often we also had a day labourer helping out. People had more time then. We had more time to drive to town in the afternoons, have visitors and things like that. Nowadays, the young farmers don't have that kind of time. In the old days, we had a pot with a rounded bottom and a brim around it so that it could fit tightly on the stove. Nowadays, we can only get flat pots. Then we had a big water kettle with a rounded bottom that would reach all the way down to the fire. Now we can only get whistling kettles, and only for electrical stoves. It's an expensive privilege to have an old stove. It was a delightful occupation to look after the animals. We had a 3-legged milchstool and a milk pail, and we sat down under the cow and rested our heads on its side. It was a lovely warmth, and if the cow was friendly, we got a warm lick when we began to milk. Then we sat and sang to the cow. We have so many beautiful songs, and we always sang while we were milking. We never had bedrooms by the stalls, as they had in many places. There were 2 rooms where the dairy used to be. They were made into labourers' rooms, with big beds with long straw. At that time, young people liked to lie in the straw. Later, when we became more modern, we got new beds with spring mattresses. But they'd still much rather sleep in the straw bed. It was much warmer, they said. We girls had 2 rooms in the loft, but it was cold there. Sometimes in the winter there would be ice on the sheet where we had breathed. But it didn't do us any harm. We had a good warm bed, a hot water bottle and a woolen blanket. What do I miss? Maybe the animals, but my health isn't what it used to be, and it is expensive to get outside help. Another solution was to invest, but we don't want to do that. Our accountant once told us not to. He said we shouldn't extend and ruin the old farm. It would just give us problems, and we'd do all right anyway. A very sensible man. Unfortunately, he died. There are 50 chickens, mostly brown ones, but also a few white crossbreeds. It's practical to have white chickens one year and brown ones the next. Then we can remember how old they are, if we want to slaughter them all. If they're too old, they aren't good for soup.
Ellers ser de ud til at koge suppe på, hvis de er alt for gamle.
The village of Svaninge, north of Fåborg, is one of the few well-preserved road cluster villages still left on Funen. The big farms line both sides of the village street, as they have done for centuries. Gamlran, a farm in Svaninge, has an unusually well-preserved farmhouse with stately furniture. It's a family farm in which Palle and Grete Ørbæk have their home.
Ja, jeg er født på gården her, og har altid kunnet tænke mig at bo her.
I was born at this farm and have always wanted to live here. As a child, I always heard about the generations that had come before us. It wasn't jammed down my throat, but I was told about it. I tended to think that the past was more exciting than the present. My father was born here, his father was born here, and his father before him. I don't know how many generations it goes back, but I have just received some papers giving the history of the farm. We moved out here in 1972 after the central heating had been installed, and we built an apartment which extended from the existing one. Otherwise, we use the whole house. I can quickly get it shipshape when we need it. Christmas is always celebrated in these rooms. It was always exciting to go into the so-called old parlour, nod to the old ones up there, and see how toothless they were. Some years ago, a man came and said he'd like to buy the farm, but he was only interested in the land. When I asked about the buildings, he said he'd tear them down. That was something that hurt deep down at the bottom of my heart. Now the farm is protected by law, and I'm very pleased about that. The listing does carry a few things with it, mostly, as far as I can see, that some changes cannot be made. Since we don't have any plans at all for alterations, apart from reasonable maintenance and practical changes, the listing is no trouble for us. The most important thing about the preservation is that the farm will continue to exist, even when we've gone, that there is something for the generations that come after us.
Skerningegård, west of Svendborg, has large outhouses which date back to around 1770. The farm almost resembles a small manor and deserves to be preserved for posterity. Skerningegård is unusual because the old buildings are still used for agricultural production. Lars Løkke Hansen owns the farm.
Der skete det her i foråret, at besætningen fik ajaskisk syge. Og ajaskisk syge, når man får det, bevirker det, at hele besætningen bliver slået ned. Den bliver aflivet.
What happened this spring was that the animals contracted pseudo-rabies, a disease which meant they had to be put down. I found myself in a situation where I had to re-evaluate things. My bank and my accountant advised me to pull the old buildings down and build something that was more modern. But I chose to modernize the old stables and preserve the buildings as they were and are now. It's an expensive affair, but the milieu around the farm would be lost otherwise, and I'd like to preserve it as long as I'm able to financially. As the machines got bigger and bigger, I had the problem that the barn gates had to be widened. I had to compromise, because the gate size I needed had to be higher. But I thought it would ruin the half-timber and the whole architecture. So we chose to dig into the ground to be able to get the machines into the building.
Inde i laden har vi så
We've put steel rafters inside the barn and cut off and removed the supporting construction to make room for the machines. At the same time, we stabilized the barn, which was leaning about 45 centimeters. But it went surprisingly smoothly, and the building didn't suffer much damage. The thatched roof is one of the things that puts most strain on us, both with regards to fire insurance and maintenance. Fire insurance for a thatched roof costs twice as much. Machinery under the thatched roof is also much more expensive to insure. I rethatch a piece every year in order to have some roof that's always neat. I'll have some that's maintained, thatched and repaired, and some that needs thatching. When we also have to live off the farm, there's no other way to do it. It would be far too much of a financial strain to take a whole building and finish that. That would perhaps cost $500,000. When we look across the country today, more and more old farms are bought by young industrious farmers who only buy them to farm the land. For them, the buildings are only nuisances. Buildings are pulled down as fast as possible. He has to pay fire insurance and a lot of other things. Fixed costs that'll strain his economy. I understand it seen from his perspective. He has to make a living. If old Danish farms are to be preserved, we must preserve fewer of them, but give the operator financial support he can feel. Then he'll have a positive attitude towards doing the work that's connected with an old farm. At the same time, he'll be reasonably compensated. There ought to be some funds. The old peasant culture and its buildings will disappear otherwise.
Der bør findes nogle midler, fordi ellers vil den gamle bondekultur med de bygninger, som det indeholdt, forsvinde.
The development of Danish agriculture has put major demands on mechanization and efficiency. Within a few decades, the Danish farmland and its architecture has radically changed in character. The new buildings have no regional character. Modern farm buildings could be situated anywhere in Western Europe. The old farm buildings are rarely usable in modern farming and are often allowed to decay or are being torn down. The countdown over the Funen farm has already started. Farm built around a quadrangle in Martofte, one of Hinsholm's best preserved farms. The same farm, 2 outhouses demolished in 1989. A farm in Boense surrounded by old trees and with a large barn. The barn was pulled down in 1990 and the farm has lost its character. Österhessinge Vicarage, full of atmosphere and history. The same farm, the outhouses demolished in 1988. A large farm in Millinge, characteristically situated at the village entrance. The same farm, outhouses torn down in 1988 and the farmhouse roof covered by asbestos cement. Farm in Sanderum. The large fireplace with hot boiler and oven in the scully is preserved. The farm is under demolition. Farm in the village of Voltofte, once one of Funen's most well-preserved villages. Another farm in Voltofte is currently being demolished. The list could go on. Each time an old farm or parts of it disappears, a scar is left in the village or the landscape. The problem is not that one farm is pulled down. The problem is that old farms all over Funen are disappearing in a steady stream. Funen's culture landscape is slowly getting poorer and poorer. But there is still hope for some of the threatened farms. Many people who are looking for a house have realized the qualities in the old buildings and their often unique location in the landscape. Many farms are therefore bought by non-farmers and for small businesses. Those who have the knack can often do quite a bit of the restoration work themselves. But it is important to consult experts in order to make sure the work's done with due respect for the old materials and traditions. Reimer Rasmussen from Vissenbjerg has been a thatcher for 45 years.
Det træ, vi tænker på, det er Wilhelm. Det er Wilhelm. Ja. Og de bunter der, vi tænker med, de vejer sådan ungefær.
The roof we're thatching is wheat straw. The bunches of wheat long straw we use weigh about 2 kilos each and cost 8 kroner. We use 12 bunches per square meter.
Sådan som her på den gård, vi står på her.
On a farm like this, they typically grow rye on the meager soil, and from this they could make long straw. In Jutland, for instance, they wouldn't dream of using straw. They have reeds over there and use that. Reeds are the best, no doubt about it. They last at least 50% longer. It's the change between rain and sun that wears them down, sun and rain together, changes from wet to dry. A small end bit will turn upwards. The next time it rains and blows, that bit will disappear. That's why the straw typically lasts longer on the north side, because the temperature doesn't fluctuate so much there.
Så forsvinder den ind. Og det er derfor, at det er så typisk, at det ligger længere i Nordsiden, for de får ikke de store temperatursvingninger.
This old copyhold farm at the Lugismose Manor dates back to the end of the 18th century. The farm has been bought by a young couple, Dominic Ovry and Lisbeth Larsen.
Ja, vi flyttede herned for 5 år siden, og vi bor, min mand og jeg, og så 2 børn. Og så har vi nogle dyr.
We moved down here 5 years ago. My husband, myself and 2 children. We have a few animals and have just started to restore the old buildings. It has, of course, been a bigger job than we originally expected when we bought something this old. One doesn't feel one can go to the beach in the afternoon, because there's always something that needs urgent work. But we have now got so far that we can begin to relax. We couldn't earlier. One has to be aware that everything can't be done in one go. It takes many years to get it the way you want, and if you're not very, very wealthy, it probably takes your whole life. It has always been my dream to have animals and be able to live like they did 100 years ago, like living in another age. That's probably why I never wanted to live with a lot of neighbors and not to have animals.
Og derfor var det nok sådan en gård. Jeg kunne ikke tænke mig at bo med en masse naboer og ikke kunne have dyr.
Spending about the same amount as would have to be paid for an ordinary modern house, the family has chosen a house and a lifestyle that many may dream of, but only few realize. Elly and Claus Køln have lived at Brillegården north of Svendborg for nearly 20 years.
Ja, da vi overtog gården i 1973, der var der ikke nogen moderne bekvemmeligheder af nogen art.
When we took over the farm in 1973, there weren't any modern conveniences at all. We could basically have the house we wanted.
It's a great pleasure to do these things. We were hardly aware of anything else during the period we were trying to create a home here.
We applied to have it officially listed. We did that because we spend a lot of money each year on maintenance. It's expensive to maintain, and we don't want to run the risk that someday, if we have to leave, a new owner would put a hard roof on the farm or pull down what he didn't need.
So often I think how things have always been the same. When you look at the starry sky from the yard, it's framed by the four wings, the very section of the sky where you can see the constellations move. Sometimes Orion peeps over the edge. Nothing has changed since my predecessors lived on this farm. It looks exactly as it did then.
Danish agriculture has hardly ever undergone such substantial change as in these past decades. The typical family operation with varied crops and cattle, pigs and poultry, doesn't exist anymore. The Danish National Museum registered in the 1930s some 700 Funen farms which deserved preservation for their building method and history. Of those 700 farms, only 52 are still well preserved. Those 52 farms have now been saved for posterity through national protection. But what happens to the many other half-timber farms and houses on Funen? It's not enough just to protect a handful of listed farms. The Funen culture landscape is an entity of houses, farms, villages and landscapes. It must be a public duty to preserve as many of these treasures as possible for posterity. It would be a sin if we were the last generation to enjoy the Funen landscape with the old thatched houses and half-timber farms.